alumnos extranjeros en el Centro de Estudios para Extranjeros, también haciendo un esfuerzo financiero para que sus alumnos y sus docentes puedan viajar a las tierras que estudian, que durante varias generaciones fue solo a través de libros. Y pues es un placer en este momento y un honor tener a tan distinguidos académicos de Medio Oriente y del norte de África, estudiosos de esas zonas, alumnos interesados en esas regiones en nuestro instituto para poder platicar. Está aquí también, creo, la directora del Museo de las Culturas Populares, con quien se ha hecho una gran alianza para intercambio de maestros, alumnos, actividades académicas. Veo en el programa que hay pues actividades que tienen que ver con el conocimiento, con adentrarnos en el conocimiento de las culturas de esos lugares en sus profundísimas raíces históricas, pero también actividades que tienen que ver con la actualidad de esos pueblos y los temas que nos unen, pues prácticamente a todos en el mundo en este momento. Muy interesante la conferencia inaugural de los persas a los mayas en la antigüedad global. En momentos en que estamos todos buscando asideros, siempre la historia es uno, posible, para bien y para mal. Hay que tener cuidado. Entonces, por favor, profesor, me disculpo de no estar en su conferencia, que revisaré en la grabación con mucho interés, porque en estos días hay gran actividad, como habrán visto en el pequeño boletín de la entrada, que apenas sí caben, y en mi propio seminario tenemos las actividades que celebran a través de una cátedra extraordinaria el trabajo, la obra poética, el trabajo descolonizador y el trabajo de traducción de clásicos griegos y latinos del fundador del instituto. Esa actividad se inaugura a las 10, por lo cual no podré quedarme a su exposición y me disculpo. I am very sorry that I won't be able to attend your lecture, which I would have, because we have at 10 o'clock the inauguration of a series of conferences around the work of our founder, Rubén Bonifaz Nuño, and I have to deliver the first one. But in the afternoon, I will be very happy to join some of your activities in the week. Entonces, es un ideal con el que a mí se me educó todavía en los libros de Torres Bodet, internacionalista, multilateralista del entendimiento entre los pueblos. También él fundó el Museo de Culturas Populares. Y me da mucho gusto saber que sin nacionalismos exclusivistas, beligerantes, invasivos o imperialistas, podemos hacer actividades de contacto internacional, de intercambio, que realmente promuevan el entendimiento de los pueblos, que es, creo, lo único que nos llevará por los caminos de paz que todos deseamos. Nuevamente, muchas gracias, doctora Shekufé. Recuerdo cuando Shekufé, que yo no podía porque tenía todavía niños que les tenía que ir a dar de comer y atender, empezó con ciclos de cine persa y ha ido transitando tanto en su trabajo académico como en sus actividades de docencia y difusión hacia ese mundo que ella conoce por estudio y por experiencia propia, por nacimiento, por derecho propio, y nos ha acercado a él. Muchas gracias, doctora Shekufé Mohamedi Shemahale. Bienvenidos a todos los que no han estado antes en nuestro instituto. Ojalá vuelvan y nos visiten muchas veces, usen nuestra biblioteca y enriquezcan nuestros diálogos. A quienes están a distancia, qué bueno que se interesen en estos temas y que amplíen sus conocimientos, y pues que sean jornadas muy propicias, muy enriquecedoras.
I would like just to make a quick translation for those who do not speak Spanish. Dr. Lilian Alvarez is welcoming all of you with very warm words and wishing for us to have a good and a fruitful week all around Semona. And she's also saying that it's a very good thing to create spaces like this to talk about different subjects that are beyond what we normally do and talk about in these spaces, especially in Filológicas or at the UNAM. And this is one of the ways we have to make peace, let's say, beyond nationalities and all the strange imperialistic thoughts and so on. And so she is also welcoming all of you. And
I'm sorry, I didn't know that it was an international audience. Yes, thank you. Welcome.
Muchas gracias. Entonces damos por inaugurada.
Yes. Gracias. Muchas gracias. And we'll see you later with the encyclopedia in the afternoon.
Muchas gracias.
Gracias
por hacer espacio.
¿Sabe compartir pantalla en el Zoom? Do you know how to share screen? Also? Si no pueden compartir, que me permita, y yo con un teclado inalámbrico comparto la parte que inicie, así ya no nos atravesamos.
Hecho en No. Habría estado bien. Porque esta es la mesa para la presidencia. Sí, claro, estaría buenísimo. No, eso es para... Sí, ya firmó. No, cuando le dije... Es que la queríamos dejar era de... Sí, era de... Bueno, que nada.
que nos firme esta línea.
Bueno, entonces ya quedó.
Y después continúa la línea aquí.
Un nome che non perché mai di video.
Eso ¿Y en otro?
Do you have a pen?
¿Aquí? Ya está. La pantalla, exacto. Muchas gracias.
شما معرفی کنم خودم میرم پایین.
بله خواهش میکنم. بله.
Bueno, buenos días de nuevo. Bienvenidos a la conferencia inaugural de esta semana de Medio Oriente y Norte de África. Para ella tenemos el gusto de contar con la presencia del profesor Touraj Daryaee y les voy a leer una breve semblanza suya. El profesor Touraj Daryaee ocupa la cátedra Masih de Estudios y Cultura Persa. Es profesor de Historia y director del Centro Dr. Samuel M. Jordan de Estudios y Cultura Persa en la Universidad de California, Irvine. Ha sido autor y editor de numerosas obras académicas, entre ellas se encuentran Sasanian Persia, The Rise and Fall of an Empire, 2009, ganadora del premio Brismes 2020 al mejor libro en el Reino Unido, y The Oxford Handbook of Iranian History, 2014, seleccionada por la revista Choice como uno de los mejores 25 libros académicos del año, y descrita como el mejor volumen único sobre la historia del mundo iraní. El profesor Daryaee también ha traducido varios textos del persa medio o pahlaví al inglés, entre ellos Shahrestanihay Iran Shahr, a Middle Persian text on late antique geography, epic and history with English and Persian translations and commentary, 2002, y On the Explanation of Chess and Backgammon, 2016. Asimismo, ha editado King of the Seven Climes, A History of the Ancient Iranian World, desde 3000 a.C. hasta 651 después de Cristo, 2020. Es editor de Dabir, Digital Archives of Brief Notes and Iran Review, publicado con E.J. Abril de Gruyter, de Sasanian Studies con Otto Harasowitz, y del proyecto Web Sasánica, Late Antique Near East Project de la Universidad de California en Irvine. El profesor Daryaee es profesor de historia en la Universidad de California, Irvine, desde 2007 y ha sido profesor visitante en la, en la Escuela Práctica de Estudios en Ciencias Sociales de París, 2010, y Bahari Senior Fellow en la Universidad de Oxford, 2014. En 2021, el profesor Daryaee fue elegido miembro de la Academia Europea de Ciencias y Artes en Salzburgo, Austria, y actualmente es el editor en jefe de la Enciclopedia Iránica. Bueno, pues le damos la bienvenida. Welcome, Dr. Daryaee. It's a pleasure to have you with us. And I will begin.
Buenos días, señoras y señores. Dr. Mohammadi, muchas gracias por todo. I would like to thank the director as well, Dr. Lilian Alvarez. And of course, it's fantastic to be back in Mexico, which I really feel at home. But I should learn Spanish, so perdón, but I'm going to speak in English. I see Luis is here, our friend, and I see Alejandra, so really wonderful to see friends as well. I am going to, as the title says, be speaking about the Persians and the Mayans. Now, before I begin this talk, I would like to share with you a Persian proverb saying, this is the image of the old city of Kerman in southeast Iran. And its main product is kumino, cumin. And we have a saying in Persian, you do not take kumino to Kerman. So for me to come and speak about the Mayans in Mexico is a bit too much, but please bear with me as to why I'm bringing the cumin to Kerman. And what I really would like to discuss is a more methodological and historical view of mine, having taught world history for about 25 years when I started. The book on the right is the world history book that I have written with several of my colleagues, which I had to do very early on, which I wouldn't want to write it again as such, but it gave me a view of the world, but also the problems, the pitfalls of world history. Because world historians like to think of connections, and in this way, for pre-modern, right, before, let's say, I know the term Columbus, so that would be the term, the Silk Road, the monsoon system, all of these are interest to the world historians. And as we wrote this book, I wrote the Middle East, I wrote some of the ancient Rome and Greece, and one of my colleagues that Mesoamerica, you know, as if everybody had their own compartment. And I figured that no one really speaks to each other. Everybody does their own field, like I do. I'm a specialist of late antique, late ancient Persia, late antique world. But of course, when we get to 15th, 16th century, and all of the continents, or most of them, become connected, like the book that has been written by Ernesto, which is world famous and certainly famous in the US, it brings the world much more together, and America has become very much part of this world history. And then it's about empires, as it was just mentioned, what imperial systems do. A good choice to use for, of course, studying history, but not always helpful. So that is where this idea of mine comes from, because I teach this ancient world to my students. Here's my class at University of California in Irvine. Every year I ask them, hello class, what is ancient history? What is antiquedad? 90% Rome, Greece, okay? So where are we living? United States. Do you know the history of the land that you lived on? They think, many of them don't even think. They think that we're living on a blank sort of earth, and suddenly it came 300 years ago. Except some of my students who are Mexican immigrants, or their parents, or from Central America or Latin, they nod their head like this. Oh yes, they understand. But we're conditioned to think in the United States that ancient world is Rome and Greece. And that is, in ancient studies, that is the norm. That is what usually people think. And of course, my field of late antiquity, is it antigüedad tardía, in Spanish maybe, late antiquity, is a field that it developed in Europe. It was this gentleman who first coined the term, Alois Reigel, in his Die ägyptischen Textilfunde im Österreichischen Museum, in 1899 said, late antiquity, dealing with the Mediterranean, Egyptian Christian textile. And very soon the idea was that late antiquity as a field is Christian and solely Mediterranean. Until today, still for many, that is it. They hold the gates, they say, no, we only concentrate on the Mediterranean and nothing else. Of course, for me, which I deal with the Persians in late antiquity, this side was always for me of interest, because that's what I do. I said, why? Why there should be only this? Is it so different, or why? Until 1971, Peter Brown, one of the famous historians of late antiquity, dealing with the Mediterranean, makes a comment and actually writes a few pages about Persia in late antiquity. Sassanid Persia, 200 to 700 CE, yeah? And says, no, this could be discussed in some ways. So in a way, he first suggests that Emperor Justinian in the 6th century can be set aside with Khosrow I, the Sasanian Persian ruler, and look at the administration, look at the way both empires operate. Look at their ideas and beliefs, certainly different religions. You know, the worldview is different, but there are structural similarities. Now, to my mind, this is brilliant. I'm very happy he mentioned it. Not too many people accepted it, but there's still some people, like myself. I wonder, why wouldn't I put him? I know this is outlandish. Justinian and Khosrow and maybe Pakal II. Why can't these important personages who do important things, building monuments, temples, and structures, why can't they be put together for a period about 200 to 800, which is the same time? Now, in the past 2-3 decades, I have tried to show that, in fact, late antiquity can be Imperio Sassanida Persia and Imperio Byzantino or Roman Imperium. But as I teach more world history, my idea is, yes, the Sasanians called the ancient world at the time the two eyes of the earth, Rome and Persia. That was their perception. But why do we have to accept that? The Romanists think only the Mediterranean. Ancient Persians sees them as the two eyes of the earth. I wonder why only these two. So I asked my professor, after I studied with him at UCLA, University of California in Los Angeles, to tell me and write something, his name is Michael Morony, about why should the Persia, Sasanian Iran, be studied along with Rome? Is there any similarity? And he wrote an article, should Sasanian Iran be included in late antiquity? And in his article, he invokes 17 similarities between the late Roman and the Sasanian Empire. And just to briefly mention, these are about the idea of divine rule to human rule and how they transform, hierarchic pyramidical structures of a society, warfare and religious character, this highly stratified society, I think all of this is kind of not universal, but you could find it in many ways and you could understand where I am going towards the Mayans. And I really thought this is an important article, and it was. Many people who did not want to include beside Mediterranean in the late antiquity were somewhat convinced. And it's based that article in 2008, some 2 decades later, of course, that I am inspired to actually say, could the Mayans and the Persians be studied in the global phenomena in global history? Is that possible? Can I give you some points? It's an initial idea, but could they be studied side by side? And why do they have to always be connected? Of course, as I've mentioned, not only the Sasanians, but for me, the Guptas who are hiding here, the Qin Empire, they have structures that are similar. Of course, they're somewhat connected, I understand. My Chinese historians are very isolationist. The Chinese historians don't want to really, in late antiquity, to deal with other parts. China is of its own. It's its own character. Until the Silk Road, and there are some connections, but still, they don't want to be part of this late antiquity, although some have now moved gradually. My Indian historians are much more interested, Guptas, because Gupta is like isolated, the golden age of India for several centuries, and then what happens? But the Guptas and the Persians, and they are similar. But that is, of course, a methodological issues. So the idea of connections and connected histories are very important. Obviously, Sanjay Subrahmanyam, who is the most famous of the early modern world historians, this is newly published collected essays of his connected history, again, are in search of connections and connected histories. This is not longue durée history of thousands of years. It's not micro history of a little village or a town, but connections cross-culturally. And I like that. But rather than just simply connected history, I would like to ask, let's look at the map of the world in the late ancient world. And if we look at the late ancient world, I know terminology is used here, classical is somewhat, but I'm thinking of 200 to 800. Can we have this type of a history as what I would like to call disconnected histories? Rather than looking at connections all the time, let's think of comparing kingdoms, empires, civilizations who are far apart, dislocated, disconnected, but yet I think common human institutions and institutional settings prevail. As you can see, the Mesoamerican one, the Maya one, and the Asian one. I'm just using this image. There are no contacts, but obviously you see in terms of structural building and what it can give you. Some of this may be, of course, superficial for you because there are similarities and there are similarities. Some things are basic and some things are a bit more deep-rooted. But if you bear with me, I am going to just make a couple of examples, and this is my beginning to delve into it. And I hope to come to Mexico more and to Guatemala and Belize and learn more from colleagues of my Mayan scholars. But again, my sense is here, can we look at civilizations of the same period on different continents? I think yes. Can we look at structural similarities of the late ancient Iran or Persia and the classical Maya? I think yes. And at the beginning, maybe these similarities are not apparent. Each are their own world. It's a different universe. It's a different world. About 15 years ago, what I do is I have these primary sources. And I ask my students in ancient history to read about creation, how these people imagine the world, how it's created. So I give them a passage or part of the Popol Vuh, which you would know all much better than I. And then I give them a passage from the Bundaheshen, the Book of Primal Creation. This is a Zoroastrian Middle Persian text from late antique Persia, which we just had it translated in the US in a modern English translation, which I presented to Dr. Mohammadi, who has been so kind through the years with me. And it's interesting. the first thing that students already pick up is this, the importance of the vegetal world in terms of creation. After a first sacrifice or multiple attempts as creating humanity, of course, one is maize, and of course that has to be related to here. In Persia, the first couple, and humans come from rhubarb. Rhubarbio was in Spanish? Rhubarb. So it's really interesting, and to discuss the non-Abrahamic creation stories for them, because most of them know Adam and Eve, rib, and the tree. But there's so many others of looking at the world, how the world comes into being. And for these people, it's this vegetal world that is really of interest, of a common beginning of humanities for the first couple. And this idea of the first sacrifice and the continuation of the cosmos, how the sun should go up, at night should come down, the vegetation should grow, the seasons should change, is part of this Zoroastrian worldview, which you can see these magi, the Zoroastrian priests, Persian priests, or these are Indian priests, are performing something that was done from antiquity, in late antiquity, for 4 hours before the sunrise. The priests sit before each other, this complicated table there, but it's very simple. There's the sacred fire, and there's plants, there's milk, and they basically recite the Avesta, but in the way that how the world, the cosmos came into being, how the world was put into place. And so Ahura Mazda, the creator God, doesn't create, he puts things in order. And that's very important. And they retell the story of the order. But why? They tell the story of this cosmical order is because in order for the day to continue, in order for the year to continue, in order to have the seasons and so on, so humanity and life continues. I am not even going to make a mention of the Mayan sort of priesthood, but this sense with the idea of keeping this cycle, I think is something that can be explored between the two sides. The next issue is what we call generally as a field of shamanism. When I was a student at UCLA, I used to go to this center. It's called Carlos Castaneda Center. Carlos Castaneda was a student in our university, but a couple of decades before us. Of course, we all read, his book, Don Juan, the teachings of Don Juan. We all read it. So, very interesting, the idea of shamans and so on. And as I started studying ancient Iranian texts, the Avesta, which are the Zoroastrian holy hymns, Middle Persian things, I began to see this sort of striking similarities, and I was very daring. I wrote maybe 25 years ago an article on shamanistic elements in Zoroastrianism. It is clearly has shamanistic elements to it. It's undeniable. There was a huge fight in the 1950s and 60s where a scholar by the name of Samuel Henrik Newberg wrote a book called Religionen des Alten Iran, where Zarathustra, the prophet of this religion, was imagined as a medicine man, as a shaman, who was actually doing what a shaman do. And all the material that is needed for ecstasy and to make the journey, they're all in the texts. You can see it in that way if you want to. And then there was vehement reaction by some German scholars that, this is not a witch doctor, this is a prophet. Okay, but it's undeniable that in the Zoroastrian, Persian, Iranian tradition, you take hallucinogenic, either a plant with milk, you take bang, hashish with wine, or other forms of a sort of material to give you this extraterrestrial vision and to have visions of the future and to tell what's going on. And something that's been recently published is this rock inscription. I think it was Franz Grenet in Collège de France, along with another colleague, that have found this image, which shows a Zoroastrian priest, but it's a specific Zoroastrian priest. They're called the Sarausha priest, the second line, as you can see. And Sarausha is a deity in Zoroastrianism. It's a bird. Its form manifestation in the text is a cock in Spanish, galo. And if you can see the image, the Zoroastrian priest of Sarausha has wings, feathers, and he's in fact, his beak is showing like this, tending to the fire. It's interesting that these Sarausha priests were expert healers. They were in sense of healing. And, but in the Avesta, the sacred Zoroastrian texts themselves, in Yasht 5, which I put YT5, I apologize, it's part of the Avesta. It's dedicated to a female deity that is very important as a patron deity in late antiquity, Anahita, Lady Anahita, who provides in the text magical feathers, which gives you magical powers. Now, if you ask Dr. Mohammadi, who's the expert on the Shahnameh, would tell us that this image is clear from the father of the great hero of the Book of Kings, the Shahnameh in Persian, Zal, who bears Rostam, the greatest hero of them. He's raised by a fabulous bird, and the bird actually bestows feather that he can burn to invoke him at any time of trouble. And in the Avesta, when you're at war, you could invoke actually this. Now, all of this, I'm not going to talk about shamanism in Mesoamerica, or this is, again, taking Kuman to Kerman, but I hope you can see the similarities of what priests, medical doctors, or shamans, however you want to, that there are indeed interesting similarities between the two religions. What the Persians are doing there, and I think the Mayans are much closer than anything the Romans do. Okay, I think it's even closer in terms of this view. Of course, for my students, the most interesting is the ball game when we get to Mesoamerica, but for different reasons, obviously. They have heard all sorts of tales and so on. I tend to explain it based on what I have read, that why do they play the ball game? Well, the outcome of the game, we would explain that could legitimize a ruler's authority. It demonstrates divine favor, and with victories used to reinforce social status and power. That is how I try to explain the ball game, beside how it is and what it is not. But we should remember in late antiquity, in late ancient world, in Persia, the sport that was par excellence, that was really, we think, invented by the Persians, is polo. And the game of polo, of course, continued in its history, but in a very strange way. Polo is played in Persia throughout its history, but the British who colonized India like the sport, and they take that sport to Europe, and it becomes the sport of, very posh and so on. But this is actually an exercise of dexterity, of, power. But in a book associated with the founder of the Persian Empire in late antiquity, called the Book of the Deeds of Ardashir, son of Babak. He ruled from 224 to 240 CE, but the text is from 7th century probably. The passage states Ardashir, the founder of this empire, the Persian Empire, acted accordingly with the aid of the gods. They've sent him with the other nobles from the other dynasties. He became more victorious and warlike than them all. So he's the best one. Why? Because on polo and riding ground, he surpasses them. In another passage, he's able to hit the polo ball so hard and so far away that nobody else can. This in itself is exactly saying this, that because he's good in polo, this is a sign of power and providence, that he is going to be the ruler. So this is how I sort of compare this in my classes for people to understand, rather than just an isolated sort of matter of how human societies and empires can be worked together. I do not know of sort of the Mayan sort of tradition of creating these beautiful dishes, but on the left, which is the Persian one, the point is clear. It's wealth and status, where the king and his status and place vis-a-vis others on top and bottom are shown. And it's interesting, at least in Persia, these dishes were sent to neighboring kingdoms and empires to show the status of the ruler. So maybe one of the Mayans here would be able to tell me why these dishes are made in the Mayan world. And are there similarities to this where the ruler, the local potentate, is displaying his power against the defeated and the power of his court? I hope these are some of the similarities that I think I was going to mention, but even more for me are the inscriptions. The Ahwa and the Shah, so the ruler and the ruler. Here, I think it's striking similarity of the ruler sitting on the throne, obviously here on the horse, again, it's hierarchical, where the captives and the people, the intermediaries are shown. And here you have the glyphs explaining, and here you have the inscription in Middle Persian explaining what is going on. It is really uncanny the way I see this sort of Mayan sort of inscriptional, which is much more, and it's so large, and now it's been, of course, better read, I think, recent times, and in comparison with Sasanian Persian rock reliefs and inscriptions. I think they almost portray the same thing. In terms of material culture, the blue, the royal blue, there are only few places in the world that you'll have this really expanded. In Asia, is in China, it's in Iran and Persia, where the blues are still used for mosques and sort of designs, in Afghanistan and Egypt, right? And then there is the royal blue here of the Mayas. So that is just really interesting for simple comparison, but taste of what is interest to both in terms of material culture. So last year when I came to Mexico, I went to the Anthropological Museum for the first time, which I can say without a doubt, much more beautiful than anything in the Louvre, the British Museum. That hall, that big hall, where all the reliefs are, as you enter, there's no room, I think, like that. And then I got to meet at least the mask of Kinich Janab Pakal II going down, which was really fascinating. And everybody thinks of something. And I was down there and I'm looking at the mask. For me as a Persianist, what do I think? The mask of Shapur II. That's what I would obviously just invoke in my mind. And then I said, okay, this is really interesting. And Shapur II is the longest ruling Persian king. Okay. Oh, Kinich Janab Pakal apparently also had a very long rule. Yeah, the longest ruling apparently of the classical Maya period. You might correct me, but more interesting is their ideas of kingship and, more importantly, gender and power, women's agency. It's interesting that both rulers, for me, at the beginning of the rule, there were two women, and I hope it's Lady Zakuk on the left, the mother of Pakal. And then here is Ifra Hormizd look-alike seal of a Persian noble lady. This is the mother of the next King Shapur III, but you can get the sense of it. They're both regents, and they make sure that their sons are raised, stay alive, and achieve rulership. And it's only a few years after their rulership that each of them die. So the idea of women's agency, and this is not the only instance, both I think in the Mayan case and both in the Sasanian case. We have multiple royal ladies, women who act as regents and actually control the affairs until their son or one of them comes to power. Now, some of this that I think poked my interest here about Mayan kingship and rule is because I was on part of a committee at the American Historical Association to give an award. And every year they give an award. It's called the James Henry Breasted Award in Pre-Modern History. And it's usually a Roman, you get some Greek, or sometimes you might get an Egyptian one. So I was on the committee. What did I do? I gave the award to someone who's really, I think, deserving of it. His name is Simon Martin, who had written a book, Ancient Maya Politics, a political anthropology of the classical period. And for me, reading that book was really eye-opening. And the way he explains the Mayan politics of, several hundred polities and powers, and how they interact and they work together, and at other times there's this competition. This is not really too far from the late antique Iranian world. Of course, in the late antique Iranian world, you have the king of kings because he's the great king of that. But you find that sort of a prestige of the Mayan ruler in some ways, especially from the West, over others. And when we talk about kingship, the idea of patron deities, both for the Mayans, and I already mentioned the Persians with Lady Anahita, is quite interesting as patron deities. And the idea is that rulers, both in this tradition, initially claim at least either lineage from the gods or their relationship to the gods make them important. And that, I think, it's the same thing. And more importantly, the ritual act, what the Mayan ruler does and what the Sasanian rulers does. And I'm not going to explain it too long because it's going to bore you. This should be written. But this idea of ritual act to make yourself important and show your power and glory is very much apparent in both cases. And of course, lastly, the idea of food and sacrifice and feeding the gazan for your ancestors. Clearly, we find in both cases in the inscriptions. And so it's this type of, I think, ideas that at least is coming to my mind. But lastly, again, when I was a student, Mr. Jared Diamond was professor there, so we went to his talks. But of course, a very Eurocentric view of fall and decline, as there is the book of the decline of Iran-Shah, how the Sasanians sort of fell. It's interesting, both of these texts dealing with the Mayans and here with the Persians discuss, of course, things that are very common, and various reasons have been given: deforestation, plague, invasion, resettlement, fatalism, which you find both, I think, in the both traditions, and then on the left is northern Iranian plateau. Dr. Mohammadi, is that close to where you're? I mean, it's probably Shomal, yeah. And then on the other side is the Mayan. So what happened to this sort of lush forest? Well, some of it, of course, exists. And the decline or the fall, however you want to call it, was it caused because of shortages, civil wars? And all of these explanations have been provided for the Mayans. I've looked at the multiple sort of reasons given, and it's a long list. But it's the same thing for the Persians. And now, of course, the discussion is more of a decline or a transition or crumble. I am not going to take more of your time. I've done, I think, 32 minutes. But I want to make the point, as a daring, you might say, historian here, I would like to think that while the Mayans and the Persians are world apart, in some ways there are striking similarities between the two. And this study, I think, merits that we just don't think about our neighbors, who they are, to study only in isolation our own sort of civilization, and to think in a more broader context of not simple Silk Road connections. And furthermore, the last picture, of course, is the Zoroastrian Fire Festival that is still done, and of course the other one you would know more. Thank you.
Muchas gracias. Thank you very much.
De nada.
Daryaee.
Pleasure.
Entonces tenemos bastante tiempo para conversar. Si tienen preguntas, comentarios. We have enough time for questions, comments, if you wish, and you can make them in English or Spanish, and there will be translation, no problem.
So I would like to thank Professor Daryaee for the conference. So it's at least for us, for the Mexican people, to have you here in Mexico.
It's my pleasure.
So it was very shocking for me the title of the presentation, because I would say that to relate the Sasanian world with the Mayan world, maybe 20 years ago, it would be a little bit surprising. But for me, it was more or less the same experience. More with my humility, not at your level, but during my teaching here in Mexico, also the ancient Near East, I realized that all the ancient world has more similarities that we could see as such. You pointed some of them, and I would like to ask you about another of
Yes.
these relations. So the first thing, you spoke certainly about this late antique concept, but I will take the point, the start point, I will take a little bit earlier. In my opinion, I think in the middle of the first millennium BC, 6th century BC,
Third century.
Sixth
Sixth century BC.
we put, this is the Asian period, right, with early Achaemenid period, etc. At that point, I see that these changes of the Sasanian or Archaic period start a little bit earlier. Even the material world, even the pottery, when you see the Mayan world, or you see this Tepehuitzal late period world, it's, of course it's not the same, but the varnish, the wear is quite similar. I don't know why, but it's this sensation. Also with this shamanic visions, for example, the Arda Name is for me very, very similar to this broken test about the hell vision of a Syrian prince, a small test of the late Assyrian period. And it's quite similar. So that would be a question.
Sure.
Don't you see that these changes start earlier than the?
I agree. I think, first of all, of course, the Persians, they learn immensely from the Assyrians. I mean, Assyria is the great cultural center, or the culture. So when the Persians come as nomads onto the Iranian plateau, these are the people who have the writing culture. And I'm sure some of these themes of journey, shamanistic version is obviously there. Of course, here, the Zoroastrian one has very ripe sort of amount of texts and traditions from the 3rd century, exactly from the 3rd to Ardaviraf to the 6th, 7th century, where you have repeatedly the prophet sees trees with different metals. Ardaviraf goes to sleep 7 days and night, goes to heaven, hell, and purgatory, Amstagon. So it becomes very it bears fruit of this long tradition. But since you're a pottery expert, and we've seen Tapesar together, he's been very kind to take me to show it, you would know in the pottery, since I am not an archaeologist, but you already are pointing that this similarity of pottery, I think is quite interesting. I think the polo was probably also a game that already had begun in the Parthian period. in the late Parthian, early Sasanian. That's why Ardashir defeats the Parthian kings. So, but still, it's a similar thing in terms of games.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, thank you. It's good to see you again, my friend.
Thank you for your
pleasure.
presentations. It was fascinating, especially for me. I don't know much about Persians nor Mayans, so I discovered a lot of things and learned a lot.
My pleasure.
And so it made me also wonder how you came to connect the disconnected. So how came you started looking at the Mayans specifically? Could have been another empire. So maybe this is a question about your trajectory of research, how you came to connect these two
Sure.
in you looking at them. And the second question would be these striking similarities. What do you do with them now? Or do you have an idea or hypothesis of why at the same time you have these such striking similarities in two disconnected worlds? I mean, it's fascinating. And maybe you already have some hypotheses.
So for my world history, my students are, at least in the United States, they do 1 week Mesopotamia, 1 week, Greece, 1 week Rome. It's like a tourism. I had a professor of Near Eastern history. His name was Bucciolati, sort of worked on Syria. He said he was Italian. He says ancient history is like inverse tourism. We take you to places and places. Okay, this is fine. But if you do this, by the time we get to Mesoamerica, week 10, they first of all have forgotten what was going on between 200 and 800 in Asia. How about we play around? And I decided to say, rather than doing this weekly thing, let's think about this late ancient world period. Let's look at these societies together, and one even far distant away, that, on its look, it may be very different from others, right? The way you dress, what is going on. But in fact, if you just pay attention a little bit more, I think there are structures that are similar to the Mayan, to the Persian, to the Indian Gupta, and the Qin one, whether these historians of these places like it or not. It is there, and there's much more. And I want to sort of explore this common humanity and institutions of different places. We talk about pyramids. I mean, students always ask me, there are two questions. How come pyramids, and there are pyramids, of course, ziggurats, but also pyramids in Egypt and then in Mesoamerica? There are two answers. Either they went on ships they rode, right? Or the most common US programs are aliens came to teach them. And I say, absolutely, this is correct, because these programs in the United States are there to tell you that, look, only with all due respect, the white people can build these buildings, right? And leave edifices. If the people in Mexico do it, or like in Iran, these are, it must be the aliens. They don't have the faculty to do it, right? Obviously, I'm being joking, of course. But leaving that aside, it's common human, I think. They're common ideas, and they develop, interestingly for me, is that they're developing at the same time. And that is so interesting. So what is it? And that's, I think, to think about and discuss. Yes.
I have the microphone, so or actually gave me the microphone, so I'm going to ask a question and then Camila. Yes, thank you very much for the presentation. I think I'm going to use your book for my students. So,
my pleasure.
But I was also, after Jasmine's question, why did you decided to use Mayan culture and not Aztec?
Good question.
For this comparison.
That is true. I mean, at the beginning, there's a very silly reason for it. And then there's a practical one. One is I'm interested in a period, I want to see between 200 and 800 through the world what's going on. Okay? And the Mayans are present very much, not that I said, but it's really the ascendancy of the Mayas. And then it's collapse and the Sasanians collapse. So for me, I already had that in mind. Secondly, when I think I was on vacation with Fahima, I detest these resorts and places. Okay, hate it. I can last one day. And then, I just travel. I take a car and I just went from, location to location, Ekbalam, I would go, to these places. Utterly fascinating, of this sort of multi-centric world of kings, which is somewhat like the Arsakid. If I wanted to actually explain the Arsakid Empire, I would use the Mayans as an example. They're together, but they're not together. They band together when they need to, and sometimes, but the experience, it was firsthand experience that made me think of this, and the time period.
So thank you very much for your talk, which was fascinating.
Thank you.
And I have a question because I sense a tension in your talk between this fascinating and very provocative idea of disconnection, right? Thinking through, thinking with not only connected histories, but disconnected histories. And the question of shamanism as a shared heritage, right? And I'm an anthropologist by training, and there are anthropologists, for example, who are specialists of the circumarctic region, and who are, who make these big claims about traditions which are shared across huge geographies, which would be equivalent to the ones that you're, laying out for us, just, in a different latitude, right? So it's an invitation, right, to talk to the anthropologists and maybe think with the anthropologists about these questions of regionalization, because if it's valid, to do this in the present and to take the Arctic as a unit, right? Why not, go closer to the equator and think of that as a valid unit of connected history as well as of disconnected history, right? And I'm very intrigued because I'm actually currently working with midwives and with the birth period as a trans moment, as a moment of trans. And many of them are healers who, sometimes participate in what people are calling neo-shamanism, right? But some of them have long lineages of, tradition passed down through oral history and practice in terms of putting things in their place, right? And creating or facilitating life or new life through ritual and through putting things in their place. And I'm fascinated by your provocation.
Thank you.
And I think you should hold both, or I would be interested in seeing you develop both, the idea of disconnection and connection.
Connection. Thank you. Yes, thank you so much. It was a very good anthropological explanation of what I just said. That's actually very good. The thing about shamanism and Persia, in nationalist discourse, shamanism is kind of seen as a lower sort of, form of a religious practice. While, if you have a prophet such as Zarathustra, which, has sacred hymns associated with it, brings it in a different status and makes it comparable to, Abrahamic, if we think of that as a thing. So, the sensibility is a little bit strange to come to tell, look at the shamanistic elements that are, and it could be initially shocking. But then when you say, look at this comparative view of the equator, or sort of where we're looking, but I think probably they all may go back to actually sort of this movement of people and this sort of shamanistic tradition in the northern hemisphere, all the way north, that may be actually part of that heritage that cannot be, I think, denied in some ways.
Hi, thanks for your presentation. When I saw the publicity of your talk, I was impressed because I'm studying a particularly similar case in the 19th century.
Wow.
There's a French guy called Charles-Étienne Brasseur de Bourbourg who started studying the Maya, and actually he was the one who discovered all the documents we know about Maya. The Chilambalam, Ravinalachi, the documents from Landa, etc. And when he started exploring this Mayan region, he saw like a similarity with what we call Orient, or Oriente.
Sí, sí.
And he started working with this. And then Napoleon III took his work because he wanted to do the same thing that Napoleon I did with Egypt. So it's funny to see that now in another time, like we call the classic, from the 200 to the 800, you see also other similarities. So my question would be, in the case of Professor de Bourbouk, it was a political statement. They wanted to try to insert America in a discussion about how all these cultures of these big civilizations were connected. So someone asked, what would be your hypothesis of this? And I think that what Camila mentioned is very important, because when I saw the map, we see the equator going through all these cultures that had a particular development. And in the case of the Maya, we know each time with more elements that part of the decline of the civilization was climatic conditions, no?
Yes.
So I was wondering, maybe at the same time, in the same part of the globe, something similar was going on in the climate situation.
The short answer to your last question is yes. We have this sort of the frozen, sort of the cold sort of period that strikes towards the end of the Sasanian period. And so there is climactic coming. For me, my statement is humanistic. It's neither political, it's humanistic. And it's the idea that actually if one continues looking at these civilizations, you begin to actually see common conditions. And one world is not so otherworldly, to the sensibility of people. You just have to go through this sort of just a facade, maybe, although I gave you lots of facade, to think about the common conditions. It's not that one culture is superior to the other one at this time. In fact, there are many similarities of cultural traits. So that's my statement on that.
And just to finish my question, I was thinking in Edouard Said and how we project so many things from our perspective to understand these other cultures that are far away in time, but also in space. So how would your position as an academic in the Occidental world influence in seeing these similarities?
Obviously, I'm bound by my knowledge, which is limited, very limited. I am a scholar of late ancient Persia, Sasanian Persia. That's what I mainly write about. I have tried to push myself in terms of time to go back, okay, and also to look at other cultures as a world historian. I have a friend, his name is Ramin Jahanbeglu, an old friend, who is a really interesting intellectual and writers. And he picks different intellectuals, different countries, different worlds, and writes about them and why they're important, which is, I think, really important. He calls me in Persian, Zahir Farhangha. I'm like a, I don't know, I think jokingly or maybe seriously, he says, you're someone who's really interested in other cultures. So my grounding is limited. I know what it is, but I keep trying to sort of move out, and I keep trying to go places and look at things. And of course, read, but reading doesn't do justice. I think you have to be on the terrain. You have to see things in order to get a better sense of this. Otherwise, you become an armchair historian, which I hope I'm not.
Yeah, thank you very much for your presentation. It was very interesting and thought-provoking. I'm speaking as a historian of the modern Middle East, so.
Oh, okay.
But it's what is interesting for me is your approach. This broad comparative approach. So yeah, obviously you need many different skills to approach all these worlds, and like many different linguistic skills and technical skills, etc. So it's a whole program, I guess. But I was wondering, like you are looking at the similarities, which is very interesting, but historically, if you are like trying to make these comparisons, do you also look for some differences so that you could put these similarities into perspective? Because now we just have a glimpse of what you did, so we cannot really judge, but it seems that we have like a whole, catalog of very interesting similarities. And have you looked for structural or differences that could also maybe put them into perspective.
I think that's really a good point. And again, as I'm starting, I'm looking at similarities because at this time period, the idea is that these words are so different is already a stated understanding amongst many. And I'm saying, hold on, there are differences. The way you dress, the way, your diet, clearly, what food it is here. I speak with my wife, we're talking about sort of the different food that you consume based on what there is. Obviously, there are differences. And I think that is clear, right? But it should be contextualized, as you're saying. And I should just say, side note, when I started school, I was interested in revolutions in Latin America. My first year, I took revolution in Latin America, and I took Middle East, so I sort of was, reading about Guatemala and sort of, Chile and sort of, I took an entire course on the revolution in Mexico with sort of Porfirio Diaz period. And so I was actually traversing some other world until some professor tricked me. And then I just like, whoosh, it just was taken aback. So, and of course I did modern Middle East as a field.
Thank you so much for your presentation. And I am not a historian or an academic. I'm a feminist author and I'm from Egypt. So I'm the resident Egyptian here.
Fantastic.
And watching the connections that you made is especially important to me as an Egyptian and as a feminist, because I'm writing a book that centers Hatshepsut, who in the ancient world was the most powerful person for 20 years. But what your presentation made me think of is how in the so-called West, it's always Cleopatra who is the one that is most centered because of her connections with Rome and the rise of Rome, because as Egypt was declining, Rome was on the rise, thanks to the money they got from Cleopatra and the relationships and all of that. But overall, I think what most struck me as an Egyptian who lives in the US is the way that today we are finally decentering the so-called West. And I think Donald Trump is helping destroy the so-called West and helping those of us who are not from the so-called West finally, find a space to say, listen, we are much older than you and we have all these ancient civilizations and we can hopscotch over you and see each other, because as an Egyptian, I feel very at home in Mexico in the way that you said,
I do too.
Right?
I feel very much at home.
I feel the people look like my people. I feel the whole atmosphere, everything. And it's a fascinating time to be alive because I think that we are doing that. Oh, I see you and I see you. And we're decentering and hopscotching over the so-called West in ways that I think will enrich the histories that we will develop for the future. And for me as a feminist, will center those, what you talked about with gender, you talked about when it came to gender and women's agency, because, one of the ancient scholars, Herodotus, went to ancient Egypt and said, the women here have so much agency, they urinate standing up, because that for him was the image of a powerful woman, that she basically pees like a man, and things like that.
Herodotus has the same for Persian women. They manipulate their son, because they're powerful and they're manipulative. It was for both, I think.
Right? Yeah. So this idea, all these ideas of kind of like undiscovered women and undiscovered roles for women in those ancient civilizations, I hope will come forward more and more. And so I really appreciate you made me think of so many things, not necessarily Persian and Mayan, but also connecting kind of the collective unconscious, as Jung would call it,
Yeah, we don't need to look at our cultures through the prism of sort of Western, well, we're in the West, but Eurocentric prism of things. We can hopscotch, as you say. I went to Egypt because I was teaching Egypt. I have to go. It just cannot be that I show a bunch of, 2 pyramids and say, okay, here's Egypt. I need to experience it. So I went a couple of, and also found similarities and at home as well. And it's that experience that I think makes us sort of realize this bond of humanity and just as people one-to-one. So I have the same sense in Egypt, and I miss it. Actually, I've told Farima that we have to, not that your museum is open. And I work with a colleague of mine now at UCI, our first Egyptologist that is hired. She's from Brazil, Luisa. She's really fantastic, a young scholar. So we talk about constantly on how we can collaborate with each other. but
Yeah,
you're
well,
to the point.
so-called West, I should say white, because it's whiteness and Eurocentrism, and rather than kind of geographical positioning, but thank you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to meet you.
I have something to say about the last intervention. So, the weight of the imperial job is very heavy. So the main process were talking in English instead of Spanish or Persian should be. So, and we remain to go to all references. For example, it was said it's a good reference, but it's not the right one for our thought. I mean, it was said spoke about the French and British imperialists. Our relationship, in my opinion, is very different. So the Spanish, Hispanic, Iranian relationship is so much longer and recent. You go to the Garcia de Silva expedition in the 17th century, or Rivadeneira in the 19th, and you read their impressions, and they are more from a broader ship than the English or the British.
Interesting. Okay.
So
with the Spanish one,
of course, I think it's more or less the same. Not the same, but similar with the Russian people. The Russian Orientalism is very different. So I think it's a very good observation, and yes, I think it's our opportunity to establish a relationship between two and two, no,
yes,
to the United States or
that's right. I should just quickly comment, I've been talking to Alejandra, I'm trying to push her, and of course, Shagufta is here. We really want to do Iranian studies. We can do all of this in the States, but I really want to do it in Mexico, which, as she once told me last year, this is the gateway to Latin America. And so if we can do it here, it introduces, I think, this world, not via CNN and, Fox News, but rather through another media.
So just before you ask your question, now that
That you have the microphone.
I just wanted to add to what I've been hearing here about, I think Margarita's question is actually telling us something, talking about one of the debates we have a lot in Latin America. And of course, she's also one of our colleagues who studies the Mayans and so on. So this is always a natural question to ask oneself, okay, you are trying to get close to this subject, why are you going to do that? No? And so I think it's a perfectly comprehensible question to ask, and at the same time, I think it is politically important. But I think in this case, as Mona and Jose Luis tried to explain, the question is, this is like a study based on love and interest, and done for that, for the same, let's say, aims. So yeah, maybe, I mean, I understand your question, but I also understand where Dr. Daryaee is coming from, no? And this is important to do it just over all the Western filter that we always have, that makes us think that there may be like a hidden, let's say, I don't know, conspiration going on. No, it's really. I think this is just a space where we as Mexicans and we as Iranians can talk about these things without having somebody else telling us how to get to know each other and how to get close to each other.
And we should do that with Egypt too. We should do it with Egypt as well, I think, so very much so.
Hello, thank you for your presentation. I was sorry to be
a little late, so I
That's
also
okay.
hope my question is not something that was already addressed.
No, pleasure.
But also related with the question about it reminds me now about the climate change in the 6th century, etc. This concept of late antiquity, right? Which I understand comes mostly from Peter Brown and historians of the Mediterranean, no? and the late classical work. There it is. So yeah, I was wondering because although it's the same time, no, the question, this subject we're speaking of, the Mayans, also taking from reference the European, the classical history. This is usually known as the classical period, no, of the Mayans, of Mesoamerica. I am more familiar with Teotihuacan, or like the central part of Mexico. So I see that maybe you already discussed this, but I was wondering, how do you understand this concept of late antiquity in the case of Iran and
Yeah, so
this region?
I think before you came, I said that it was thought very much to be Mediterranean, to be Christian. This was, and it's still for many it is. They don't buy what we profess, but that's fine. And here I said, well, there's been some push to the neighboring Persia, maybe, you know, and so on. But my point is that there are other societies and civilizations that can be done. Just take the years 200, however you want to measure it, to 800. Be it the great sort of frost or sort of climactic. There are works done by people who do the Middle East. Now it forgets me and I'm going to get killed by him, but Richard Bullitt, cotton, camel, and so on. You know, and you look at, you know, other works for other places, you see that they're in fact, I was part of a group that did some work, you know, but they were the scientists. I just filled the context. There are periods in the 6th century in Iran where there is actually a drought. Texts tell us, but now there's information. So some of this, I think, is cross-cultural. So why not? Why not we start with the Mayans and go all the way to Japan or to China and look at all of them and see what is going on? It's common things can be happening to all of these people.
Of course. And well, just also aside of that, it will seem also here in Mexico, we had the situation of more nomadic people, sometimes known as chichimecas, no? Coming down from the north precisely due to climate change. And I don't know if you have also approached this side of all the theories about the collapse of Teotihuacan and more in central Mexico, because I also always found very interesting the parallels both with perhaps the Mongolian dynasties of China or the Germanic people in Rome, this idea of a more nomadic people that approaches a perhaps more older settled civilization, but ends up becoming like the hegemonic one.
So, I mean, we think of actually 5th, 6th century in Eurasia is because of climatic changes in northern, I think, Eurasia, which really pushes, even before the Mongols, the Turkic tribe, the Hephthalites, and these successive groups that we now begin to understand who they are from the 5th century even. During this time of Shapur, you have people who are called Alkhons, the Hephthalites, and then the Hans obviously is a result of these climactic, I think, now that is explained, to move from the north and the east and come down and take over or pressure these areas.
Thank you for your lecture, Doctor.
Thank
Yes,
you.
what made me think is that beyond finding similarities, the point is to start thinking old history everywhere. What was going in Africa? Maybe they didn't have temples. What was going in Oceania? Everywhere people is, there is history in ancient times, no? So it's a very good starting point to focus our studies. We in museums love to make lines, comparison lines. So when we make an exhibition, we put Greece, Rome, and we in Mexico like to put what was going on here to relate our history to the rest of the world. But in the world histories, in the mainstream or the most important books published in the 20th century, our history is not in. So it's very important to start putting America's old history in this antiquity history, so that this is a very good starting point for putting this in a more serious way. What was going on in old history everywhere, and to think like that, no? To open those bridges to those regions.
I agree with you. I couldn't agree enough with you, Alejandra. We should do global history. I mean, I am at fault as a world historian. We've been thinking of connections, but we can do global history. And, you know, one of the reasons, in fact, I got a little bit into this Sasanian Persian world is I remember in the when I started school, grad school, now you'll know 1991, you know, I was looking at the Oxford map, historical map of the world. It's interesting. It's the Persian Empire is there, and it's in the Empire of Alexander the Great. Until the coming of Islam, the place was blank, as if there was nothing going on in these places. What? You know, who made this map in Oxford to think that there was like a blank place? And so that was actually an impetus that, you know, we exist here. It's just not what you think that is happening in the world. I agree with you.
Well, going back with what you said, Shekufe, I think it's, a very interesting way to see, you know, why, like, our histories have been made from the Occidental perspective, and it's very nice to have this context to cross our visions of history. And in this perspective, it's very interesting that Maya and Persian are similar in the way we see our identities departing from these very big civilizations from the past. And I think this is something similar in both societies. And we don't have that in all Latin America. We have it in Peru, for example, where they also have this Inca society. And I think the construction of identities is very different when we have this idea of a glorious past. And probably you have to reflect about how our identities are stroked by these ideas, no? And in a similar way, but in different cultural contexts.
I mean, I am guilty of that. I should not, you know, that I think of this Sasanian Persia is the kernel of this Iranian identity, and certain traits are still with us today. You know, but how you present it could be much more nuanced. It could be better. It doesn't need to be, you know, just it's me, it's my empire, and there's nothing else. No, obviously that is clearly not the case.
But I think also where you're coming from is because you work on the Mayans of the present.
Yeah. So that's really, the living sort of tradition, which is really interesting.
And may I ask another question?
Por favor, please.
You were talking about how lectures these kings gave before sitting on the throne also had to do with each other. Could you maybe go a little bit deeper into that?
You mean the Mayan and the Persian one, which I would be. You're talking about this type of sort of thing, or I didn't give the lectures really, actually.
So I mean, when they wanted to start, let's say, to be crowned or so on, they were.
I think you know this because you know the Shahnameh, the Persian Book of Kings, which we talked about, is of course the councils, and their book of councils. I don't know of the Mayan side actually, but of course, I mean, I think a quarter of the Persian Book of Kings is just the councils on how to rule, how to be righteous, what to do, who to contact, and of course shows a stratified society. So that is, I think, it's really sort of the treasure trove. I don't know the Mayan side. I have to learn.
Is there somewhere we can read about that, Margarita?
About Mayan
About like their lectures of power when a king would want to sit on the throne or crown.
What would we do?
It's a story about how to be good and how to be bad. But also the
Epigraphy.
Archaeological stelas are written by governors, and they explain their history, their place in society, and etc. I think epigraphy would be the more direct discourse from the high powers of Maya.
And are they translated into?
Yes, most of them are, yeah. And here we have very good epigraphists.
Which I try to teach myself, but I've been unsuccessful, but I've been actually trying.
Okay, so thank you very much.
Thank you.
Again,
Thank you for coming. Muchas
also
gracias.
for taking our questions and comments. Thank you very much for listening and for participating. So we have our first sessions after this in 3 different spaces, starting at 12. So I do invite you to stay if you're interested. You can also see the program in the QR code. And yeah, so have a good week. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Vagan lütfen.
Muchas gracias.